Chapter 1. The Hat on the Pew. It was a Sunday like any other in the village of Little Wexford, a hamlet so content in its rhythm that even the seasons seemed reluctant to disturb it. The hedgerows bowed heavy with early summer bloom. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and polished oak, and the faint bell from St. Mildred's church tolled its familiar call across the green. The villagers, in turn, responded as they always did, with measured steps and well-practiced civility. Among them came Miss Jane Marple, upright and unhurried, her gloved hands folded around her worn prayer book, her neat blue hat tilted just slightly forward to shade her eyes. Those eyes, pale as frost and twice as penetrating, missed very little. The Sunday service passed without distinction, hymns sung dutifully, pews filled by habit rather than conviction, the vicar's sermon kindly if unremarkable. It was not until the final hymn faded and the congregation stirred to leave that the first oddity was noticed. "Now what on earth is that doing there?" murmured Mrs. Weatherby, leaning slightly across the aisle and pointing her gloved hand toward the fourth pew on the left. A hat, but not just any hat. A rather bold affair, deep burgundy felt with an extravagant satin ribbon and a small spray of pheasant feathers curling at the side. It sat conspicuously alone, without any accompanying handbag, scarf or cardigan to suggest its owner. The pew, according to anyone who cared to know, had been entirely empty throughout the service. "Not mine," sniffed Mrs. Pym, whose hat collection was legendary in the Women's Fellowship. "Far too forward, I should think." "It certainly wasn't there when I passed by at the beginning," muttered Major Blencourt, whose military mustache bristled at the sight of anything disorderly, even millinery. "Some girl's forgetfulness, no doubt." A whisper rippled through the church like the rustle of hymn pages. Miss Marple, who had just risen to leave, lingered. She tilted her head slightly. "That's a very specific sort of hat," she said to no one in particular. "Rather like the kind worn for effect, not comfort." Detective Inspector Craddock, on holiday from London and visiting his aunt as it happened, stepped forward with amused authority. "Well, unless it turns out to be ticking," he said dryly, "I suggest we leave it with the vicar and not jump to conclusions. No need to involve Scotland Yard just yet." Laughter followed, nervous as laughter often is when mystery scratches faintly at the door. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment longer, not at the hat, but at the pew, specifically at a shallow, reddish smear on the edge of the polished wood, easily missed by those bustling past. "Berry stain, no doubt," murmured Miss Hartnell, bustling past. "You know how the children sneak sweets in their pockets." Miss Marple said. By Tuesday morning, the hat remained unclaimed in the vicarage, sitting atop a silver salver as though it had been presented in ceremony, yet its presence seemed to sour the air. Villagers passed it in the hallway as if it might speak, or worse, accuse. Then came the news that shattered the charm of Little Wexford. Charlotte Haywood, newly arrived to the village 3 weeks prior, staying as a companion to the ailing Mrs. Bartlett, was found dead. In the orchard behind the Bartlett cottage, her slender frame folded like a scarf under the blossom-laden branches, her head oddly tilted, as though in conversation with the earth. "No signs of violence," the constable reported, "but something's wrong about it, wrong in a quiet sort of way." The hat in the church? Vanished by then. The vicar's housekeeper swore she had left it precisely where it was. And yet, come morning, it was gone. Not misplaced, gone. No note, no visitor, and certainly no one claiming it. Miss Marple, who had only met Charlotte once at the grocer's, remembered her vividly. Not because of anything she had said, but because of how she hadn't spoken when she ought to have. The kind of silence, Miss Marple knew well, that signaled an unshed burden. "Pretty girl," said Mr. Arkwright, the baker, shaking his head. "Kept to herself, though." always seemed as if she were listening for something behind her. "Rumours," muttered Mrs. Pym. "You know how these types are. Arrive quietly, but always some man or inheritance following close behind. I dare say this'll bring them crawling out like worms in a storm." Charlotte's death was ruled an accident, for now. The orchard had a treacherous patch of ground, roots tangled just below the surface. A fall. Perhaps fainting. It was all very unfortunate, very sad, and very convenient. Miss Marple sat that evening with her knitting untouched in her lap, gazing out the window at the gentle sway of the linden tree. A young girl with no family ties, a flamboyant hat that appeared and vanished, and a smear on the pew that wasn't jam or berry at all. It was paint, or possibly something worse. She sipped her tea slowly, the way she did when the past whispered too close. Murder, in Miss Marple's experience, rarely arrived with fanfare. It tiptoed in, disguised as the ordinary. But it always left a shadow, and in little Wexford, the shadow had just begun to lengthen. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Post Office. By Wednesday morning, little Wexford was alive with rumour, despite, or perhaps because of, the air of cultivated restraint the villagers prided themselves on. The early sun painted the thatched roofs golden, but a tension hung over the hedgerows and ivy-clad cottages like a veil that hadn't been drawn quite right. At the post office, which doubled as a general store and social nerve centre, Mrs. Babington stood behind the counter, arranging stamps with deliberate care. Her eyes flicked up now and then, alert to the ebb and flow of gossip. That morning, there was no shortage. "I suppose they'll send someone from county for the autopsy," said Mrs. Pym, fussing with her handbag, though she had no post to send. "That orchard of Mrs. Bartlett's always looks shady to me." "I expect they'll hush it up," replied Mr. Trelawney, whose sour mouth gave every sentence the tone of a complaint. "Girls like that, London types with vague connections, don't bring much good if you ask me." "She wasn't from London," said young Clara Sims, barely 19 and red-cheeked with the effort of daring to contradict. "She said she'd lived near Bath before coming here. She used to draw a lot. Little sketches of the houses and flowers. I thought she was kind." Mrs. Babington clucked her tongue. "Kindness is all well and good, Clara. But people aren't always what they seem. Take my word for it. You learn things, standing behind this counter as long as I have. You learn who pays late, who talks sweet but stirs bitter, and who doesn't have a forwarding address when they leave town." At that moment, the bell above the door tinkled. Miss Marple stepped in, wrapped in her lilac cardigan, a modest netted hat perched neatly on her silver curls. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara brightened. "Isn't it dreadful about poor Miss Haywood?" Miss Marple nodded with measured gravity. "Very sad indeed. A quiet girl, and yet one sensed a certain strain beneath her composure. You can always tell, I think, when someone walks a little more lightly than necessary, as if they are accustomed to retreat." Mrs. Pym snorted faintly, but Miss Marple seemed not to notice. Her gaze drifted casually over the stack of newspapers and the rack of postcards, old images of the church, the war memorial, and the duck pond. "I do wonder," she said mildly, selecting a pale green envelope, "if Charlotte had any visitors while she was staying with Mrs. Bartlett." "Not a one," Mrs. Babington said. "She came into the shop twice a week, regular as clockwork, bought peppermint creams and pencils, but never received post, not so much as a card, and no one ever asked for her. Odd, come to think of it." "And her room?" Miss Marple mused. "At the Bartlett cottage?" Mrs. Pym leaned in conspiratorially. "Upstairs front. I heard from Ivy Dunn, who helps with the washing, that the bed was neatly made when they found her missing, as if she hadn't slept in it at all." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a poster advertising a charity jumble sale, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled faintly. "It's always the small things, isn't it? Beds made too neatly, hats left behind. The village never forgets what doesn't belong. Outside, she found the air brisker than before, the breeze chasing dried petals along the footpath. She passed the butcher's, the smithy, the livery yard, each door slightly ajar, each conversation lowered by one note, as if tragedy had muted the key of village life. She paused at the Bartlett gate. The house was an aging Tudor affair, black beams sagging slightly under centuries of gossip and memory. Mrs. Bartlett sat in a wicker chair by the window, wrapped in a tartan shawl, her eyes distant and unfocused. Miss Marple tapped lightly on the door. "Jane," came a soft croak from within. "I thought you might come." The sitting room was warm and filled with the scent of lavender and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Bartlett's hands trembled as she reached for her tea. "I'm not much company these days," she said, "but the Lord sends visitors when we need them." Miss Marple sat opposite, folding her hands in her lap. "How are you managing, dear?" "Oh, I get along," said Mrs. Bartlett. "Charlotte was helpful, quiet, sometimes too quiet. I don't think she liked to be touched or asked questions, but she kept my letters sorted and watered the begonias. That was enough for me." "Did she speak of anyone from before?" Miss Marple asked gently. "A family, perhaps. A friend she hoped to hear from." Mrs. Bartlett shook her head. "No one. Just said she liked the country better than the city. Said she liked how the trees sounded when they moved." There was silence for a moment. The ticking of the clock sounded very loud. "Did she go out often in the evenings?" Miss Marple inquired. "Some nights, yes," said the old woman, frowning. "She took walks. Said the air helped her think. Always polite, never a trouble. But I remember once. She came back looking pale as snow. Wouldn't say a word. Went straight to bed. That was a week ago last Thursday." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Did she wear a hat when she went out?" Mrs. Bartlett blinked. "A hat? No. Well, not usually. She didn't care for them, said they made her feel like someone else. But come to think of it, there was a new one in the hall one morning. Not hers, not mine either. Burgundy, with a great satin ribbon. I put it on the peg, and by the next day it was gone." Miss Marple said nothing, but in her mind a thread began to tighten, silently and invisibly, as threads do until they form a noose. When she left the cottage, dusk had settled over Little Wexford. The shadows were longer now, the kind that carried stories. She passed the church, the vicarage, the lich gate, all quiet. But something had been disturbed. Some truth long buried, shaken loose by the wrong hat in the wrong place, and a young woman who smiled too quietly. Miss Marple walked on, her expression calm, almost content. But behind her tranquil gaze, a question echoed steadily. Who in Little Wexford owned a hat that was never theirs to wear? Chapter 3. The Man from the Lane. By Thursday, the death of Charlotte Haywood had been quietly reclassified as unresolved, which in the local constabulary's language meant potentially troubling. Constable Sproggins, a young man whose moustache had yet to match the ambition of his boots, had made 2 visits to the Bartlett cottage and 1 to the churchyard, pacing awkwardly near the orchard trees. But even he admitted, under his breath naturally, that the whole thing felt wrong. Miss Marple, for her part, paid a morning call to the Reverend Paul Sanderson. The vicar, a kind but absent-minded bachelor, greeted her with the expression of a man surprised to find time passing. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, beckoning her inside the vicarage study. "Do sit. I'm just wrestling with next week's sermon. Something on Ruth and gleaning, I believe. Or perhaps it was patience and apples." "I've always thought apples to be very instructive," Miss Marple said gently, seating herself in a threadbare armchair. "Especially when one considers how easily they bruise, on the inside, where one can't always see it." The vicar blinked behind his glasses. "Ah, yes, indeed." Miss Marple looked about the room. I believe the hat was here last I saw. The vicar's face wrinkled with concern. Oh, yes. The curious hat. Red, no, burgundy, wasn't it? It vanished, completely. My housekeeper swears she didn't move it. I did wonder if perhaps it had been reclaimed. But no one in the village has admitted to owning it, Miss Marple murmured. Rather like Cinderella's slipper, only it fits no one. Reverend Sanderson gave a faint smile. A mystery indeed. And now, poor Miss Haywood. Yes, Miss Marple said, gazing thoughtfully at a dust-covered globe beside his desk. Such a curious case. A girl with no attachments, a sudden death, and an abandoned hat. As if someone left a calling card, then thought better of it. As she made to leave, the vicar paused. There was a man, he said suddenly, eyes sharpening. About 10 days ago, I saw him standing at the edge of the lane by the churchyard. Tall, dark coat, seemed to be watching the house, Mrs. Bartlett's cottage. I thought it odd at the time, but with visitors one never knows. Did Charlotte ever speak of any gentlemen callers? Miss Marple asked. Never a word, the vicar replied. But the man had a purposeful look, not loitering, more like waiting. Miss Marple left with a quiet thank you and walked the short gravel path toward the lane behind the churchyard wall. The morning air had a hush about it, as if the village held its breath. She reached the lane. There, where the hedge bowed inward and the grass flattened from foot traffic, she paused. No footprints remained, but her eyes scanned the space, taking in the broken stems of bramble, the slight scratch on the bark of a leaning ash tree. And then, something glinting in the underbrush. It was a cigarette case, silver-plated, with a delicate pattern etched along the rim. She stooped slowly, lifting it with the tips of her gloved fingers. Inside were 2 Turkish cigarettes, unused. On the inner lid, an engraving to F.J.H. for the silence you kept. C. Miss Marple's brows rose just a fraction. By the time she reached the village green, the postman was finishing his round and chatting with Mr. Trelawney. She stopped just as Mr. Purfey's Arkwright, the baker, came out with his flour-dusted apron still tied. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called. "You're looking very purposeful today." "As are you," she replied, eyeing the flower along his left sleeve. "Tell me, did you know Charlotte Haywood well?" "Not especially," Arkwright said, wiping his hands. "She came by for rolls sometimes. Never stayed long. Didn't talk much, but polite. Quiet." "And did she ever meet anyone outside the bakery, or wait around?" He paused. "Now that you mention it, I did see her one morning, about a week ago. She was standing by the bench near the smithy. Looked nervous, like she was waiting for someone who was late. When I asked if all was well, she smiled, but not with her eyes. Said she was meeting a friend, then hurried off." "Did you see who she met?" He shook his head. "No. Just remember the way she kept fiddling with her scarf. She had a habit of twisting it when she was uneasy." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. It's a common gesture among those who've learned to hide worry in public." She returned home and laid the cigarette case on the small writing desk by the window. Her cat, Solomon, watched her silently from the footstool. Outside, the roses climbed with oblivious grace up the trellis. Miss Marple reviewed the facts. Charlotte Haywood had no known past, and yet someone had once gifted her an engraved case, personal, emotional, and coded. A stranger had been seen watching the Bartlett cottage days before Charlotte's death. A hat, outlandish and clearly not hers, had appeared in the church and vanished just as quietly. And now this cigarette case slipped into the hedge as though discarded in haste, but something tugged at her mind. The initials, F.J.H. Names began to flutter through her memory like cards laid face down on a table, and then one turned over. Frederick James Hollinghurst, a name she had not heard in years. And one not originally from Little Wexford, but from 3 parishes over in Marston Greys. a man dismissed quietly from the county council office under indelicate circumstances. That had been, yes, 12 years ago. It was remarkable how much people forgot. But Miss Marple rarely did. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed. Somewhere behind Charlotte's gentle silences, behind the ribboned hat and the vanished man in the lane, was a story left untold. And Miss Marple, with her knitting untouched and the tea cooling at her elbow, had always been very good at stories. Chapter 4. Tea at the Hollinghursts. Friday arrived with the sort of sky that promised rain but only offered an unsettled wind. The hedges shivered, the crows in the churchyard cawed restlessly, and the villagers of Little Wexford spoke with lowered voices, as though the clouds themselves might be listening. The death of Charlotte Haywood, quiet though it had been, had frayed the town's cosy order in ways few wished to admit aloud. Miss Marple, however, had never feared disorder. She understood it the way gardeners understand weeds, not as wildness, but as misplaced design. That morning, after a mild breakfast of porridge and stewed apple, she penned a brief note and handed it to young Peter, the butcher's boy, with instructions to deliver it to Hollinghurst Manor on the far edge of the neighbouring parish. By mid-afternoon, she was seated in the Hollinghursts' sunroom, sipping Earl Grey from a porcelain cup patterned with violets. Mrs. Hollinghurst, Lillian, was a broad, florid woman with a tone of voice that suggested every sentence might end in an exclamation. Her husband, Frederick James Hollinghurst, had aged into a dry sort of elegance, with thinning grey hair, well-kept fingernails, and the faint aroma of bay rum and regret. He poured the tea with a steady hand, but avoided meeting Miss Marple's eyes directly. "Such a pleasure to see you again, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hollinghurst gushed, though I admit I was quite surprised by your note. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, folding her hands in her lap. "Only I'd been thinking about our late mutual acquaintance, Miss Charlotte Haywood." There was a pause, very brief. Mr. Hollinghurst's hand hovered a moment too long over the sugar bowl. Then he set it down gently and said, "I'm afraid I don't know the name." "Oh, I must have been mistaken," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "It's just that she used to visit Marston Gray's quite regularly, I believe. About 12 years ago, a child then, of course. Her mother taught piano, if memory serves." Mr. Hollinghurst offered a vague smile. "I'm afraid my memory of that time is rather poor." Lillian Hollinghurst was not quite as polished. "Taught piano? Oh, Fred, wasn't there that girl? What was her name? From the cottage by the schoolhouse. She used to bring those dreadful little sketches into the village shop, always drawing cats in waistcoats and things." "Clara Henderson," Mr. Hollinghurst said quickly. "Entirely unrelated." "Ah," said Miss Marple, with a gentle nod. "Of course. And such charming engravings one finds these days, don't you think? I came across the most delicate little cigarette case the other day, tucked away just near our churchyard lane. Engraved initials, too." Mr. Hollinghurst's teacup clicked very softly against the saucer. "Found objects always fascinate me," Miss Marple continued, voice light as thistledown. "So personal, so easily dropped, and yet never without a story." There was a tension in the room now, as subtle as a draught. Mrs. Hollinghurst glanced at her husband, then back at Miss Marple. "I'm not sure I follow." "No matter," Miss Marple said brightly, standing with a rustle of her skirt. "Just the sort of thing that piques an old woman's curiosity. Thank you both for the tea." Mr. Hollinghurst escorted her to the door with formal civility, though his eyes were shadowed. As the door shut behind her, Miss Marple walked down the gravel path with deliberate steps. The glint of truth, she had found, often came not from answers, but from the silences in between. That evening, she sat quietly in her parlour, knitting in her lap, the cigarette case beside her on the table. Solomon the cat purred faintly from the window sill, as if lulled by the tension in the room. She reviewed the tapestry, now weaving itself together. Frederick Hollinghurst had been linked to a vague scandal over a decade earlier, something quickly dismissed, never fully spoken of. A young girl, too delicate to name, too poor to fight back. Charlotte Haywood had been that girl, or her daughter. The engraved message inside the case was not romantic. As it had first seemed, it was transactional, for the silence you kept. But what had broken the silence? That night, as the village settled into a nervous hush, another whisper stirred the calm. Ivy Dunn, the Bartlett's washerwoman, arrived at Miss Marple's gate just after sundown. She was breathless and pale. "I didn't want to come," she said, twisting her apron in her hands. "Didn't want to get involved." "Then why did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because of this." Ivy pulled something from her coat pocket, a crumpled, stained scrap of notepaper. Miss Marple unfolded it with careful fingers. The writing was rushed, uneven, a woman's hand. "If something happens to me, look in the hymn book, Gnome 142. No name, no date. It was in Charlotte's coat pocket, Ivy said. She left it hanging on the peg that night, the one before they found her. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I was emptying the pockets before washing and, well, I felt it wasn't just laundry anymore." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "And what did you find in the hymn book?" Ivy's lips trembled. "I didn't look. I was too frightened. I thought, well, perhaps you would." Miss Marple stood, gathering her shawl. At the church, dusk pressed thick against the windows. With the vicar's permission, he had long since stopped asking questions when Miss Marple requested peculiar access. She moved through the rows of hymnals with quiet precision. Number 142. "O God, our help in ages past." She opened the book. Folded inside was a letter, creased, fragile. The ink had bled slightly at the corners. "Dear Father, I know who you are. I've known since the day Mother cried when the council sent her away. You thought no one would remember. But I kept your gift. You wrote my name in silver and asked for silence. I kept it for as long as I could, but I won't carry your secrets anymore. I'm not afraid of the village or what they'll say. Let them know. Let them all know." C.H. Miss Marple's hand rested gently on the paper, her eyes misted not with tears, but with quiet fury. Some crimes, she knew, were not of blood and knife, but of shame, buried until they blossomed into sorrow. And some murders began years before a body was found beneath a tree. She folded the letter and returned it to her pocket. Tomorrow she would pay another visit, not for tea this time, but for justice. Chapter 5. The Gathering of Doubt. Saturday began in low cloud and uncertain light, the kind of morning that made even the roosters second-guess their crowing. In Little Wexford, curtains twitched early, and kettle whistles filled the air like anxious punctuation. Something unspoken was stirring beneath the village's soil, and the villagers felt it in their bones before they dared speak it aloud. At the grocer's, murmurs passed behind tins of syrup and sacks of barley. At the post office, even Mrs. Babington seemed subdued, her usual flair for embroidery and gossip oddly restrained. And at the churchyard gate, someone, most likely Ivy Dunn, had left a single white carnation beneath the linden tree where Charlotte's body had been found. Miss Marple watched the world from her garden bench. The letter folded once more into her pocket, the memory of it sharper than the morning chill. The village was beginning to bristle. Not with certainty, but with the vague sense that they had all missed something. By mid-morning, Constable Sproggins arrived at the vicarage. Not, as some might expect, to discuss criminal theories, but because Miss Marple had invited him for scones. He sat rigidly on her chintz armchair, trying not to let the jam stain his cuffs. Miss Marple, unhurried, poured the tea. "Constable," she said pleasantly, "you're a thoughtful young man. and well-meaning. But tell me, if someone dies without a mark on them, what would you say killed them?" He blinked. "Well, miss, it'd depend. Could be poison. Could be a heart thing." "Yes," she nodded. "But sometimes people can die of knowledge, too." He gave a nervous chuckle. "That's not strictly in the manual." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but that's why you must look at what people hide, not what they drop." She passed him the cigarette case. "Have this examined, would you? Quietly. No need for a fuss. And let me know if any fingerprints linger where they shouldn't." He stared at it. "Belongs to the dead girl." "No," said Miss Marple, "but I believe it killed her all the same." She walked with him to the gate, then turned toward the green, where a curious scene was unfolding outside the smithy. Mrs. Weatherby, Major Blencoe, and young Clara Sims were gathered around the notice board, where a torn scrap of paper had been pinned without signature. It read, "He wore the hat she died for." A silence hovered. Clara shivered. "What does that mean?" "More of this village foolishness," Blencoe grunted. "Someone with too much imagination and too little sense." But Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not at the words, but at their rhythm. The phrasing had the unmistakable touch of grief, disguised as riddle. She turned to Clara, who had not moved. "Dear, may I ask, were you close with Charlotte?" Clara nodded, her eyes misting. "Not very, I suppose. But she listened when others didn't. She'd draw me pictures, silly ones. A fox playing a flute, a goose with a parasol." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Did she ever confide in you?" "Not directly," Clara said. "But I once asked her if she'd ever loved someone, and she said something strange. She said some things don't need to be called love to hurt just as much." Miss Marple laid a hand on Clara's arm. "And when did she say that?" Clara frowned. "Oh, it was after the spring fete. She'd seen someone there. Someone from her past, I think. She was white as paper afterwards. Said she'd made a mistake coming here." Miss Marple's heart thudded. Not quickly, but steadily, like a bell tolling from a far tower. Later that afternoon, she made her way to Ivy Dunn's cottage. The laundress lived alone on a narrow lane behind the old schoolhouse. Ivy opened the door looking flustered, her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned in a half-hearted bun. "I'm sorry to intrude," Miss Marple said gently, "but I wonder if I might ask a delicate question." Ivy stepped aside, motioning her in. "I found the letter," Miss Marple said softly. "The one in the hymn book." Ivy nodded, eyes lowered. "You did the right thing, Ivy." Ivy sat heavily at the table. "I thought maybe she was bluffing, that she just wanted someone to notice." "She wanted someone to believe her," Miss Marple corrected. "That's different." There was a pause. "She came back crying one evening," Ivy whispered. "A few days before she died. I was scrubbing linens and she just stood there in the doorway. Said she'd seen him again, the man from before, and that he still looked right through her like she didn't exist." "Did she say who he was?" "No, but she said she had something he couldn't afford for her to show, and that if anything happened, it wouldn't be an accident." Outside, the wind had picked up. A shutter creaked somewhere in the village. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Ivy. That will help more than you know." That evening, the village bell rang once, for a service that never came. The vicar claimed it had been a slip of the rope. Others whispered it was Charlotte, reminding them she'd been more than a girl who came and went. At the Hollinghurst estate, a lamp burned late into the night. Miss Marple, watching from the footpath, knew she would return there once more. But not yet. Not until the final piece slid into place. And soon it would, because someone had worn the hat, and Miss Marple was already reaching for the thread that would pull the whole tapestry down. Chapter 6. A glove by the gate. Sunday dawned cold and grey, the church bells subdued by the weight of overcast skies. In Little Wexford, the usual rhythm of worship was tinged with unease. The pews were filled, but the murmurs before service had grown softer, more speculative. Though no arrests had been made and no official statement given, everyone knew something had been discovered. Charlotte Haywood's death no longer felt like misfortune. It felt like a puzzle that was beginning to rearrange itself into a recognizable face. Miss Marple walked to church as she always did, her steps unhurried, her eyes quietly sweeping. The Bartlett cottage sat silent behind its white picket fence, ivy crawling steadily up the chimney. There was something about ivy. It never stopped climbing even when no one was looking. The church was already 3/4 full by the time she arrived. Reverend Sanderson looked especially pale this morning, fumbling his sermon papers at the pulpit. Miss Marple took her usual place in the 4th pew on the right, 3 rows behind where the mysterious burgundy hat had once sat. Today, that pew was occupied by Mrs. Hollinghurst. A rare sight. Lillian Hollinghurst rarely attended services, citing nerves or a tendency to migraines. Yet here she was, impeccably dressed in navy silk. Her gloves folded neatly in her lap. Her hat today was modest, a powder blue felt with a tiny veil, but it perched on her head with the confidence of someone who had recently remembered how to perform composure. Miss Marple watched her only briefly. The angle of her chin, the subtle tremble in her left hand, and, perhaps most tellingly, the empty space beside her. Mr. Hollinghurst was not in attendance. After the benediction, the villagers poured out as usual, but the air crackled with tension. Some lingered. Some looked toward Miss Marple with the kind of glances that say, "You'll know before we do, won't you?" She offered no indication. As she passed through the lych gate, her foot caught slightly on a stone. She steadied herself and saw it. A glove. Not just any glove. Pale kid leather, creased and expensive. A woman's glove, left carelessly, or perhaps too carefully, on the inner ledge of the gate's side column. It was damp from the mist and smudged faintly at the fingers. She picked it up delicately. The inner lining bore a faint, worn monogram. L.H. Miss Marple made no show of the find. She tucked it calmly into her handbag and continued down the lane. Later, in her drawing room, she examined it more closely. It was slightly torn at the seam of the thumb, as if wrenched from the hand in haste. A thread still clung to the inner stitch, red, fine, and unmistakably satin. She set it beside the remnants of the burgundy hat's feather, retrieved secretly from the vicarage hearth mat before it had vanished. A curious match. Almost too curious. She did not think Lillian Hollinghurst had killed Charlotte. But Lillian Hollinghurst, she now felt sure, knew exactly who had. By midday, the clouds opened in earnest, and the village retreated indoors. It was the sort of rain that encouraged secrets, long, unbroken sheets of water that softened the edges of things and made people believe the past could be rinsed clean. But truth, Miss Marple knew, clings like ink. She set out just after tea, umbrella in hand, bound for the Hollinghurst estate. The maid who opened the door was unfamiliar, temporary perhaps, brought in to cover for someone on leave. Miss Marple was shown into the drawing room, where the same blue porcelain tea set rested, untouched, on a sideboard. Mrs. Tom Hollinghurst entered moments later, a shawl clasped tight at her throat. Her eyes were not surprised. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a gracious smile. "How lovely to see you again." Miss Marple rose and held out the glove. "I believe you dropped this." For a second, a mere flicker, something passed across Lillian's face. Then she took the glove delicately, nodded, and said, "Oh, I hadn't even noticed it missing. How careless of me." "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said softly. "How certain things resurface, just when they're most inconvenient. There was no response. Miss Marple sat again, and this time she let her words fall without ceremony. "You see, Mrs. Hollinghurst, I believe your husband knew Charlotte Haywood long before she came to Little Wexford. I believe he had reason to keep her quiet, and I believe she finally decided not to stay quiet any longer." Lillian's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. "I don't think he meant to kill her. Not in the way one plans such things, but I do believe he confronted her. Perhaps she threatened exposure. Perhaps she even had letters or a confession. And when people are afraid, they act clumsily." Lillian set the glove down on the armrest beside her. Her hands were trembling now. "He said it was over," she whispered. "He said she'd agreed to leave quietly, that there'd been a misunderstanding, but I saw him that night. I saw the scratches on his wrist. And I saw, later, the hat in the hall." Miss Marple tilted her head. So it was his hat. Lillian's mouth twitched. It wasn't meant for him. But he put it on, said it made her laugh once, said it reminded her of before. A silence settled in the room, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the soft patter of rain against the windows. "He came back pale," Lillian said. "Pale and shaking. Said she'd fallen, that it was fast." "And you believed him?" She shook her head. "No, but I was tired. Tired of women who wore silence like a second skin." Miss Marple rose, her voice calm but firm. "I don't believe the law will find enough to charge him, but the village will know. Sometimes that's worse." Lillian didn't move. As Miss Marple stepped into the rain again, her umbrella opening like a quiet bloom, she felt no satisfaction, only the weight of yet another story added to the quiet archive she carried in her mind. Somewhere behind her, Lillian Hollinghurst stared at a single glove on the floor and remembered the moment she chose to pick up someone else's guilt and wear it as her own. In Little Wexford, it was always the ordinary things, a glove, a hymn book, a hat that bore the truth. And truth, Miss Marple knew, never stayed buried for long. Chapter 7. The letter that was meant to be lost. By Monday morning, the rain had left behind a village steeped in hush. Leaves glistened with reluctant sunlight. Puddles reflected the crooked eaves of the cottages, and the entire parish seemed wrapped in that muffled quiet which comes after a confession. Only no one had said the words aloud. But they all knew something had shifted. At the post office, Mrs. Babington sorted letters with an uncharacteristic slowness. The usual tidy row of morning customers hovered uncertainly, as if hoping the day's post might reveal what none of them dared ask. "Oh, I wouldn't be surprised," muttered Mr. Trelawney to no one in particular. "If the truth came in a brown envelope, it always does, doesn't it? Bill or blackmail, it's one or the other." Now, Mrs. Babington chided. "This isn't London, and people shouldn't speak about things they don't understand." But as she spoke, her hand hesitated over a small cream-colored envelope addressed in delicate script. She turned it over once, then again, then finally placed it gently on the outgoing tray, her fingers lingering. The name on the front read, "Miss Jane Marple, Danebury House, Little Wexford." By midday, the envelope had arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep, carried by Peter the butcher's boy, who always lingered a few seconds longer than necessary, in hopes of a biscuit. Inside, the letter read, "Miss Marple. There are things I cannot say aloud, things I should have said long ago. I tried to protect him, not out of love, but out of fear. He said it would ruin us both, that the village would turn, that everything we had would be ash. But I realize now I was only preserving the shell of a life that had already died. Charlotte was his daughter, not mine. I'd only just married him when she was born to another woman. Her mother disappeared soon after. Fred told me she had gone abroad, that she had wanted nothing. I believed him, until Charlotte returned. and she looked just like her. I found a letter in his drawer. She had written to him years ago, asked him to acknowledge Charlotte. Asked only that he not let her grow up thinking she was invisible. He never replied. "I'm sending you the letter. Burn it if you must. But someone ought to know." LH folded inside the envelope was a second page, yellowed and frayed. The handwriting was shakier, the ink slightly faded. "Fred, I don't want anything from you except this. Don't pretend she doesn't exist. Her name is Charlotte. She draws the sky before she can speak. She hums when she's afraid. She has your eyes and your stubborn silence. One day she'll want to know why you never came. I won't lie to her, and if I disappear, she'll find this letter. That's all I can give her. Don't let her grow up wondering whether she mattered." See, Miss Marple sat for a long time without moving. Not from shock, nothing truly shocked her anymore, but from the deep, aching certainty that this story had been written before Charlotte ever stepped foot in Little Wexford. It had been written in cowardice, edited in silence, and published in death. She folded the letters carefully and placed them in a small wooden box on the mantel. There they would stay, not as evidence, but as memory. That afternoon, she walked through the village, her gait composed, her manner as unobtrusive as ever. At the green, she passed Reverend Sanderson, who was speaking with Major Blencoe in a low, agitated tone. "Of course it's tragic," the Major was saying, "but dredging it all up now. What good can come of that?" "Truth is good," the vicar replied quietly, "even when it arrives late." Miss Marple paused just long enough to say good day, then continued to the Bartlett cottage. Ivy Dunn met her at the door, face pale but steady. "I heard," Ivy whispered. "Mrs. Babington let it slip that you'd had a letter." "I did," Miss Marple replied. "But the truth was always here, Ivy, just waiting for someone to stop looking past it." Inside the cottage, the air still held the ghost of Charlotte's presence. The pressed flowers on the windowsill, the sketchbook left on the table, the faint scent of lavender and something sharper. Ink or sorrow. Miss Marple opened the sketchbook gently. Inside were half-finished drawings, foxes with spectacles, cats playing violins, trees shaped like people. But tucked among them, on a loose sheet, was something different. It was a portrait, not of a person, but of a hat, rendered in fine pencil with delicate shading. The burgundy felt, the satin ribbon, the curl of the feather. Beside it, Charlotte had written only one word: costume. Miss Marple stared at it for a long while. Charlotte had known it wasn't hers. The hat, the gesture, the pretended civility. She had known it was all a performance, but even so, she had worn it once. Long enough to be seen, long enough to remind someone of what they had tried to forget. And then she had died. Back at Danebury House, Miss Marple prepared tea and reflected. The police still